Okay, good to see all of you. I feel like I've been here long enough that I can tell who's sitting in a different spot today. That's kind of fun. I was listening to a podcast on my way in to church this morning about the Grammys. It was a recap of who won and Beyonce getting Album of the Year finally. But they also said that the Grammys handled the reality of the fires really well because a lot of the musicians had been impacted. They'd lost homes and they had lost their instruments even. And so they thought that the Grammys had handled that devastation, that suffering very sensitively. And one of the speakers on the podcast said, you could tell that in the room life felt precarious. That even like these rich and famous singers who are winning awards, they were aware of the precariousness of life, is what the podcast host said. And I was really struck by that word because it really relates to the topic we have today about listening for God and the sense of calling in our struggles and our challenges in life. But I know that I feel that vulnerability of life and precariousness almost all the time. And lately, it's always been a challenge, but it's been hard with the plane crash. That stressed me out. And just people being sick and cold days. So I just want to name that sometimes we do feel precarious and vulnerable and need a lot of comfort and reassurance. And I hope that our lesson today will bring that, so that sense of God's presence in the challenges and struggles and vulnerability of life. So please allow me to say a prayer as we begin. Thank you, God, for your faithfulness to us, for the gift of you being love and just showering us with love unconditionally. I pray that you would help us to trust you, to be as real as we can be with you, to share our hopes and joys and also our concerns, and that we could receive your care that you so freely and willingly give. Maybe not the ways that we always want, but as we look back on our lives, we can see that you were always there. I give you thanks for the gift of Jesus and pray in his holy name. Amen. Okay, I think we might end up going to 10:20 today. Is that okay? I'm really hyper about ending when we're supposed to end. So I think we're going to end up going over a little bit today because of the really important Feed My Starving Children announcement. We are starting with this reading from 1 Samuel. This one is really special to me. This is a story that captured my attention and my heart in my 20s. And I remember reading it thinking, Hannah is a good name for a kid. And I suggested it to Joel, and he thought so too. But Hannah's name comes from my admiration of this Hannah, who pours her heart out to God. And when I first got introduced to this story and learned about Hannah, I just thought she is such a model for me. And as I think about Joel and I talking about what should we name our child who's about to be born, and we went back and forth on different names, when we landed on Hannah, it really is my hope that she grows, or she will always have some kind of relationship with God where she can pour her heart out. She has shared with me through the years that she doesn't know how to pray, and she's not actually interested yet in knowing how to do that. But as she gets older, I think she will have some moments, because life does that to us, where something happens and we have to just pour our heart out to God. So I'd like to read this story one time, this beautiful story of Hannah praying. Elkanah had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Her rival used to provoke her severely to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year after year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child. Then I will set before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. But Hannah answered, No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time. Then Eli answered, Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your sight. Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. And I'm going to be at this page 28, that first paragraph. Hannah felt called to be a mother and was deeply troubled by her infertility. Think of a time when you struggled with pain, loss, or suffering in one of your challenges and cried out to God. What words would you use to describe how you felt towards God? For example, you may have been angry or sad, frustrated or resentful, doubtful or troubled. This is quite a question. When was a time when you cried out to God? And what words would you use to describe how you felt towards God?
3 years ago, I woke up with a great big lump on my breast, and I'm like, what in the world is this? So I cried out to God, and one morning I woke up, it was gone. The great big lump was gone, and I thought, thank you, Lord. Well, a few months ago, I went for my mammogram. They said, something's wrong here. Well, you have cancer. Cancer? And I thought, this is crazy. I never dreamed. I mean, here the Lord had totally taken away this big one, and now there was 3 grains of rice, and I had to go through all this. And I'm like, Lord, how could that happen? And boy, did I cry out. And when you hear the word cancer,
Yep.
it changes your whole life. But I made it through. I'm cancer-free. Praise God.
Glad to hear you're cancer-free now. But that is, you find a lump in your breast, you cry out, you receive what felt like a miracle with it disappearing, but then 3 little tiny grains of cancer came back and you have to go through treatment. How in the world could this happen? Those are real cries out to God. Both the joy of healing and also that terrifying illness. I have a video to share with you. This is a woman named Gay, and her husband died suddenly. I'm really sorry if these topics today hit a nerve. So I understand if you need to go take a break, go to the bathroom, or just wander the building, or just need to not be a part of today. Feel free if this is too much. But I'm hoping that we can support one another. Gay lost her husband suddenly. He was young and athletic, and she was shocked. And she talks about what it was like for her to be in relationship with God after experiencing that sudden loss. So I will let you listen to Gay, and then we can have some more reflection after that.
It was just so shocking that my husband was so young and so full of life and such a dynamic Christian man. And it seemed like such an utter waste to take a person like that out of the world where he could be so used by God. And so it was totally shocking to me. I couldn't even find words to comprehend how this could have happened. And yet, this is a contradiction. At the same time, people said to me, well, this shouldn't have happened to you. You don't deserve this to have happened to you. And this, I believe, was from God. I thought, well, why not me? Why all those hundreds and thousands of people who are in emergency rooms every single day hearing bad news about someone they love? Why them and not me? What makes me so special that I should be shielded from that? There was one experience that I had after the death of my late husband. I was in the habit at the time of praying each day, and at that time I prayed on my knees by my bed. And I remember just getting down on my knees one day and take a breath to start a prayer, and nothing. I just felt abandoned. I felt as if I had nothing to say to God. And I just said to God, what's the point? And just got up and walked away. And I believe that God wants us to be real like that. And I don't like to pretend. And so I was just expressing what I felt. Like, what's the point in even talking to you? I have absolutely nothing to say to you. Goodbye. Stood up and walked away. And fortunately, I turned around again at a later time and was able to hear God and perhaps laugh at myself. But that was just a very real moment for me, and I want to always be real. I don't want to pretend everything's wonderful. I understand everything, and here's my vocation. I'm swinging from one victory to another, because life's not like that. After he died, the utter devastation. And a way that I dealt with that was by journaling. And so one of these insights that I had when I was journaling is I felt so far from God, so cut adrift in life, so alone. And I found that I had journaled that God is as close as the nucleus in each cell. He is so bound up in each one of us, not just me, but in each one of us, that it's impossible to extricate ourselves from him. And the truth of that was, it's a truth whether you acknowledge it or not. That's where God is. God is bound within the very membranes and nuclei of ourselves, our physical being. And then I realized that even though I felt so far from God and so far from my late husband, that God was there. And perhaps I was in too much pain to experience it. But it was like God's voice saying to me, I'm here. I'm never going to leave. I'm here. And so it's not that there weren't tough times after that. Of course there were. But sometimes when you have an experience like that, you cling to it. And it's a good reminder for you. God's present, whether you see God or not. And sometimes God's revealed through the words you write, that you see them on the page and you didn't even know you thought them. Sometimes God's revealed in the words of a person who speaks to you, or even a smile. God's revealed in so many ways, and sometimes we're just not able to see. And it's such a fortunate thing when we're able to see. And I suppose that if I think about where I want to go with the rest of my life, I just want to be able to see God and not pass him by. Because I think sometimes in our busyness, or we're so caught up in what we think are the important things in life, we miss the ways God's saying, I'm here. See me.
Besides her wonderful accent, what caught your attention? What are some words that you that kind of grabbed you today? Abandoned. That feeling of abandonment. Yeah. Having no words. Mm-hmm. Overwhelmed. You're not alone. Angry.
Just saying, what's the point?
Yeah.
Just got to the end of her rope completely.
Yeah, she said to God, I wrote that down too. I have nothing to say to God. What's the point? And then she got up and walked away. God is in us. And she described that for her so well, didn't she? That it's in every little cell. Yeah, why not me? Mm-hmm. I really appreciate the way she's able to articulate what her relationship with God is like. She does remind me of Hannah, the Bible character, not my daughter. And how she lifted up how it's so important for us to be real with God. Could you sense how God, for her, wanted her to be real? That God was totally fine with her saying, what's the point? And getting up and walking away. That feels to me something for all of us to give ourselves permission to do with God. And in fact, one thing I wrote down as I was listening to this again, she also said that vocation isn't one great victory after another. Did you notice that? And as I was listening to her, I was thinking, I agree with that. Vocation, and the way she described it, feels more like a relationship with God. Let's move on here. I'm just going to say a few words about these next paragraphs in order to save us some time. But our vocation in this series has been talked about as listening and discernment, listening for who God's created us to be and how God invites us to live. It lifted up that threefold dimension of vocation. of who we are, how we live, and what we do. And then it talks about vocation as the multiple callings that we experience. We talked about that last week, that we have a variety of roles and they don't exist separate in isolation from each other. And then this lesson for me is really helpful because we might be on a track that feels so great. We have a sense of answering that threefold dimension, and we have an idea of how our roles, how we're living out our roles, and then something happens that disrupts everything. Right? We just get these moments where it's like, I thought I was doing great, and now this thing came along, and now I got pushed on I'm sitting here on my butt, and I can't get up. And we did not expect this left turn that God, that we find ourselves with God. Not that God makes these things happen, but this unexpected thing that came along that was not part of our plan. That also came up in one of the earlier lessons. Hannah, she really had a calling to be a mom, but her life was shaped by years of infertility. And she was forever changed by that experience of suffering as she waited for a baby. And she poured out her anguish to God in the temple that day. And her story reminds us that vocation is not always smooth, but it's a winding road through obstacles and times of darkness. So the question then becomes, where is God in the mess and the chaos? And is this part of what God is calling me to? I wonder if you can, do you see number 1 on the middle of page 29, that question? It says, think back on a time of pain, grief, or loss in your life. How did this experience of suffering challenge your faith in God? I was reflecting on this and I had a variety of examples, I'm sure you do too, of memories of when I experienced suffering and challenge. And this morning, two examples came to me from my childhood. And they were both surgeries. When I was 5, I had to have my adenoids and tonsils taken out. No, just my adenoids taken out and tubes put in my ears. And I remember being terrified. And my doctor's name was like Dr. Doolittle or something, and I called him Dr. Dumbhead. I told my parents I hated him. And I still hate him. I did not like the way he treated me, and I was scared. And I, of course, went into the surgery and came out just fine, but I was only 5. It scared me a lot. And then when I was 10, I don't know if you know this about me, but I had a couple hollow bones in my hand. And I was riding my bike home from school one day and fell and broke my middle finger on my left hand. I thought that was very funny because I had a sling, and so my hand was like this, and I ate my peanut butter jelly sandwich like this, and one day my principal came along and told me that was inappropriate. And I was like, it's in a sling. But I had to have a full body scan because the doctors were concerned that I had hollow bones elsewhere, and it turned out they were just in my hand. And I had to have bone marrow taken out of my hip and put into my middle finger so that I could continue to use my finger. But again, that was scary. It was hard to go into surgery as a 10-year-old. And my grandma sent me a teddy bear, and I still have it today, and I named it Doc Fingers. Because it helped me through that time. And that teddy bear still gives me a sense of comfort. Those experiences, though, impacted my relationship with God because I am a worrywart. I get scared when it comes to anything health related. And I want to keep myself as safe and secure as I can so I don't have to do that again. I can just tell there's a little girl Karen inside of me that's doing everything to keep me safe. And sometimes that gets in my way in the relationship with God. That experience of suffering as a kid has made me cling really tight to some things. And I think God's inviting me to let go a little bit and to be a little more open to some experiences. I would love for you to think about what are some experiences of suffering you've had that have impacted your relationship with God. And maybe let's spend just a couple of minutes. If you don't have to go super deep. It could be like, I broke my ankle a few years ago. That was a time of suffering. Or when my dog died, my world was rocked. So with one or two people next to you, see if you can come up with some times of suffering that really impacted your life and therefore your relationship with God. Okay, and I'll bring your attention back to the center. Sounds like a lot of life experience in this room. What are some examples of suffering? You don't have to go into the details, but just some examples of suffering that came up in your small group as you talked.
At age 28, my mom committed suicide.
Yeah. Your mom committed suicide at age 28. Yeah, you were 28. Yeah.
My parents both died within 11 weeks of each other, and then I was diagnosed more recently with breast cancer, and 2 years later, pancreatic cancer.
So your parents died within 11 weeks of each other. You were diagnosed with breast cancer and then later pancreatic cancer. Yeah. So I think I heard you. Your mother died, your one son died, and another son went to prison in 2017. And then you wished that God would take you to heaven because you felt so tired. And then you found a sense of purpose through that. Thank you for sharing that. That is an example that sometimes in suffering, we do get a sense of purpose. It can come out of our suffering. For example, I have a friend who's about 10 years younger than me, and she lost her husband suddenly, not prepared for it. It changed her whole life, not just because she lost her husband, but she went back and got her college degree so she can be a grief counselor. She always had those gifts and a desire to help people, but now she has an even deeper purpose and sense of calling because of what she endured from losing her husband so suddenly. So sometimes God can work with our grief and suffering and help us see the gifts we've already had and then allow our life experience to become a blessing for others through our suffering. So anyone else have anything you want to, does anyone else have an example of suffering that you would just need to say out loud today? Okay. Thank you for sharing and thank you for talking about this. I know that it's heavy. I also know that this is one of the things church is meant for. We are meant to be a community together to support each other. And one of our promises that we proclaim through our faith is that life comes through death. So when we're together and naming these things, we can see we end up becoming a witness to each other of God's presence and of how God can bring forth life from our deepest sufferings. So now I'm in the middle of page 29 under that question with the words, as difficult as they can be to bear, times of darkness do not mean an absence of God's call. Sometimes, if we reframe our understanding of how vocation relates to suffering, we gain a new perspective on how God has been calling us all along. Darkness can be, and suffering can be extremely destabilizing and disruptive. And we can feel as though God is absent because we're so confused and overwhelmed. And we might feel like we've completely lost our way. And I think we just have to be in that time and claim our Hannah-ness, that we just can talk to God however we need to talk to God, and maybe that means the silent treatment for a little bit. But through our suffering, we can also hopefully keep a little voice, or maybe a friend and family member can remind us, God has created you as a unique part of creation, and you are still invited to help God make this world a nicer place, a kinder, gentler, more just place, as I talked about last week. So this material, I think this next section is super nerdy, and I love it. Because this is one of my favorite things I've ever learned about listening to God and vocation. Consider how changing the preposition that is used with the verb of calling can transform its meaning. I love using this idea of prepositions to help us listen for God. So what this is doing is changing the word, the preposition around the word called. So when we're going through times of suffering, we can be called in a difficult situation, to act in a certain way or to have a particular attitude. Even if we can't change the circumstances, we can respond in ways that allow our vocation to flourish. And I like this example because I think we've all known someone who's had a serious illness, and we're amazed by their grace and compassion. They've been able to accept the illness, and then when you come and try and take care of them, they actually end up taking care of you. There's something about being called within a very difficult situation, and compassion is one of the things that flow, which can be a vocation. We can be called away from a situation, and that might be a relationship, a toxic workplace, or a negative environment. There are times when we're going through difficulty, challenges, and suffering when actually God's calling us away from that experience. We don't have to keep ourselves in that difficult situation. If we're really listening, God might be saying, this isn't good for you, let's move on. And it takes courage to do that and trust that God will continue to be with us as we feel called away from a difficult situation. So if you're in a challenge and there's a lot of suffering, maybe that's something you can pour your heart out to God. Is this a time that I'm being called away from something? I know in my own life, I've felt called away from some painful friendships. Friendships that were once good. I like the word toxic. Then they got toxic. It was not good for me to stay in that friendship. Friendships come and go, right? It's really hard to end them. But I felt God was calling me away from that so I could really be a healthier person. Sometimes we be called for something as we come to see a purpose greater than our own comfort or happiness. Perhaps we can become a companion or mentor for others grappling with the same difficulties. That's like my friend who, after the death of her husband, felt called to become a grief counselor. She felt called for something. We can be called to a new part of our vocation as a result of loss or difficulty, as our eyes are open to a new possibility, opportunity, or way of thinking. For example, a couple who has lived through years of infertility may find themselves called to adopt or foster a child. Experiences of pain or loss can bring a deeper sense of empathy with others or gratitude for other gifts we have received. And we can be called by God in the suffering we experience. We feel moved to respond by doing what we can to change the painful situation or to bring new life from an experience of loss. For example, a person may change careers or take on a new volunteer opportunity once they have experienced the loss of a loved one or witnessed firsthand the suffering that comes from extreme poverty. God can work through our anger, frustration, or sadness to create something positive. I don't know if you've known someone who's been like that. They learn about a cause, and it really upsets them. And they felt called by God to change their whole life to go work on this cause. And it seems from the outside like, you're crazy. You're leaving your job to go do that. But they feel called to a higher purpose because of the suffering that they're experiencing that other people are going through. So I hope in your groups you can really think about these prepositions of vocation. Have there been times when you've been called in suffering, called away from something because of the suffering, called for something, called to a new part of your vocation as a result of suffering, or called by God to respond to suffering in some way? And I'm going to be careful with our time. So I'm going to go to the page 31, right above the word sharing. And before I read this paragraph, I just want to say that, sometimes we feel abandoned by God in suffering. Or sometimes I hear, why would God do this or let this happen to me? And we all have to go through that. That's a natural feeling of responding to suffering. Why is this happening? Where are you, God? And as we live through the suffering and accept what our new life is, we become, I think, like Gay, where we notice God's fingerprints in our lives. And we realize that God actually has been there all along, carrying us through. And it sometimes takes years to see that God was there. And we're not doing it wrong. Suffering and challenging and struggles are really hard. And that's why we can just pour our heart out and also be open to the new life that is growing within us even while we suffer. And this promise that life comes through death. And we experience all kinds of little deaths throughout our life, not just the big one at the end. But we have to let go of a lot of things as we go through our life. And God always promises to bring new life from any kind of death we experience. So this final paragraph right above sharing, the obstacles we meet through times of crisis may eventually be found to reveal God's presence. Hannah met God in the rawest moments of her grief and anger, pouring out her feelings at the temple. And Eli the priest assured her that God had heard her cry and desired for her to find peace. So too does the God who calls us remain the God who hears us, even when the road grows dark and the way is no longer certain. Even in the midst of all the mystery of suffering, we can trust that we're still on our path, God is still with us, and we will find our way. Okay, next week is our final session together, and we're going to talk about vocation as it develops and changes over time. So this is the heaviest one. Next week we'll get to talk about as our life continues and we change and grow throughout our adulthood. Thanks for your time. Thanks for going over today. I appreciate it. And I hope you have a good conversation. And leaders, you have a meeting at 11:15, and we have to pray.